President of the United States, I am mindful of the dangers that we face. They cross my desk every morning. I lead the strongest military that the world has ever known, and I will never hesitate to protect my country or our allies unilaterally and by force where necessary.
President Barack Obama spoke to the world on Monday, and by Monday night the consensus was in. The American leader's words fell on mostly deaf ears because the president of Russia parried and answered back brilliantly. And we've got to face reality. The Russians are seeking to fill the gaps left by American lack of will and results. And what it may do to the future of the Middle East can be frightening. Break out a hefty plate of borscht. Let's go ahead and get to work. First up, he spent 3 decades on Capitol Hill, former Pennsylvania congressman, committee chairman. He was in office when the former Soviet Union existed, and thus has a keen knowledge of what their current leader may indeed be planning. Welcome Wexler Walker to the Hard Line. Also joined by founder and president of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, a sought-after voice on a wide range of national security issues, and weekly foreign desk columnist at the Washington Times, Clifford May. Gentlemen, I want to thank you both for joining us. And Congressman, let me get to you first. Seeing everything that you have seen in the last 24 to 48 hours, any doubt in your mind that Vladimir Putin played this brilliantly? There's a vacuum there, and he is taking advantage of American intransigence and also lack of will to get things done, and what could happen could be frightening.
It's extremely disturbing what's taken place over the last few hours because it highlights the fact that if you go back to my time in Congress, Ronald Reagan won the war through strength, the Cold War, and we now have Barack Obama reigniting the Cold War because of his weakness. And that was no more on display than what took place in New York.
Clifford, when you look at what the president said and how Vladimir Putin parried back, is it just possible perhaps, that the president is playing this right, that he is going to let Vladimir Putin do something foolish, burn himself out, think about troops on the ground, and it just might be the right way to get back at a guy who back home has got all sorts of economic problems?
I don't think that's what President Obama has in mind. And things can work out many different ways. I'm afraid that President Obama came into office with an idea that is not realistic, and that is that you can have America in retreat and the international community, some benign force, rise up instead and take care of these problems. And instead you have a power vacuum, and that power vacuum is quickly filled by such actors as Vladimir Putin, who is sort of he is post-Soviet, but he has no interest in freedom and no interest in democracy. He is sort of czarist in his view. He wants to expand Russia's power and influence, not least in the Middle East. And I'm afraid that President Obama doesn't understand that a policy of appeasement, which is true in terms of Russia and Iran, and retreat, means that very bad actors, Iran, Russia, and others, are going to fill that vacuum very quickly. That's what we're seeing here.
Well, Congressman, let me follow up a little bit on that and come back to something else. Let me expand on this. The possibility, as I said, that maybe the Russian people paying a high price for the annexation of Crimea, the money that's there, maybe this is just a madman Putin who wants to get involved in war. What's your take on this? Is it perhaps waiting him out, and maybe he can't do what he wants to do simply because it's not possible at this time in the Russian government?
I think that's wishful thinking. I think that Putin is maintaining his strength inside Russia with this nationalist approach that he's taken with regard to Ukraine and now the Middle East. And I think he is strengthened by taking these actions on the world stage, despite the fact that he has major economic problems at home. It's one of the reasons why we need to use our energy strength to further challenge him in the war across the world, the economic war. And the fact is that we're not doing that either. We're not exporting our oil in a way that would allow other nations to rely upon us rather than on Russia. I mean, I see this as a power play by Putin that he thinks strengthens him at home, not weakens him.
All right, now here's the shoe that dropped earlier today. Russian airstrikes in Syria could happen at any time right now, according to a U.S. official with knowledge of the latest intelligence telling CNN they could start at any moment. They are ready. Now, then let me get to this. Pentagon Press Secretary Peter Cook talked about Ashton Carter, the defense secretary, his decision to open up the lines of communication with Russia with regard to what's happening in Syria. Here's what he said today.
The United States and Russia have a common interest in fighting ISIL in Syria. The purpose of these deconfliction discussions will be to ensure that ongoing coalition air operations are not interrupted by any future Russian military activity, to ensure the safety of coalition air crews and to avoid misjudgment and miscalculation.
There's a phrase in there that I heard, Clifford, deconfliction. This sounds like that the American government is doing everything they can to avoid a war, to avoid a mistake here. And isn't that one of the most dangerous things you can get in a situation like this? You're going to have military boots on the ground, planes flying around. This has become a real nightmare in the making.
I think that's all true. I don't blame Ashton Carter for what he's doing. The last thing you want is for American and Russian planes to be shooting each other out of the sky by accident. That can happen in a situation like this. But understand, I think the bigger picture, and I agree with Congressman Walker on this, President Obama said he was going to degrade and eventually destroy ISIS. He hasn't done that. What Obama's whole coalition on this is essentially falling apart as Putin comes in and says, essentially, you don't know what you're doing. I'll take over. If you want to, you can join with me because I'm going to put together an effort. And his effort is being put together, the effort of Vladimir Putin, who I said was post-Soviet, but he's also rather neo-Soviet and a Russian empire builder. It's being put together with the self-proclaimed jihadists of Iran and with the terrorists of Hezbollah, as well as Assad, who has killed 220,000 or so of his own people and is an actor who is very much the governor general, you might say, the regent of the Iranians and of the Russians. He's not an independent actor. This is very bad. This means that essentially the United States is being pushed aside and being told, don't get in our way. And when we hear deconfliction, it means we're going to try to stay out of the way.
While Vladimir Putin is talking about the fact that relations are rather low between the two countries, let's briefly talk about what happens in the region. Here's a former deputy head for assessment of Israeli military intelligence saying Russia has no intention of allowing Syria to be split off into different states, and that, according to him, which is a little shocking, he says Russia's military presence could be beneficial to the region. Here's what he said.
The Russian presence in Syria is a moderate presence. It will help in stabilizing the area, and especially if Russia has the intent to fight the Islamic State together with the United States and the Western coalition.
Congressman Walker, to you first. Is it just possible that the Russian boots on the ground and the military there could settle things?
Well, I don't think that they're likely to settle things, but what it says is that the mistake of pulling our troops out of Iraq some months ago was a terrible mistake, because as long as we had those people in the area, they were the source of stability. The fact that the president did not move ahead when the red line was drawn with American action in Syria means that we lost our chance to provide stability. And so now the Russians are being looked at in that region as being a source of stability. That's a disaster for the United States going forward.
30 seconds to you, Congressman. With what's happened here, are we now closer to war than ever before with the Russians?
I don't think we're close to war with the Russians. I think what we have is Putin using his own influence in the area to push us aside. And that's very dangerous as we look toward the future.
Clifford, as we look to the future, do we not need to point out as well that while the president talks about we will not let Bashar al-Assad stay in power, the Russians say no, he will stay in power, there's still going to be a vacuum here. No one really has any idea nor plan what happens if indeed Assad is gone. And won't that then put us in another war situation and again destabilize the Middle East to a new extent?
Most important thing is to finally, at long last, recognize that there is a war taking place. It's a war with jihadists and Islamists of various stripes, Sunni and Shia alike, and we do not have a strategy for fighting this war. In Syria and Iraq, you have ISIS, you have Al-Qaeda, and you have the jihadist regime called the Islamic Republic of Iran. And now we have the Russians as well. We have no strategy under the current administration. It is imperative that we get one soon.
I got a yes or no question for both of you. First of all, to you, Clifford. 1 year from today, will Bashar al-Assad still be in power in Syria?
It's very likely at this point that he will, although I don't think Assad, the person in power, is the key ingredient here. The question is whether the Iranian and Russian empires are going to continue to grow in the Middle East and beyond.
10-second answer to you, Congressman Walker. Same question.
Unfortunately, yes.
And there's the problem right there, because you're still going to have a guy who enjoys killing his own people in power. Congressman Robert Walker, Clifford May, want to thank you both for joining us very much. We will continue to follow this story. Stay with us. Donald Trump, a new bauble for the public. We'll talk about it next on The Hard Line.